The first snow came early that year, before the calendar even turned, blanketing the Appalachian Ridge in a thick, almost suffocating silence. The trees bowed under the weight of white, and the wind cut through the valleys like a sharpened blade. It was the kind of cold that made men reconsider every choice that brought them here. Most folks in the nearby town of Elkmont had retreated to their heated houses, stocked pantries, and humming furnaces. But not Jackson Hale. Jackson had been a hunter all his life. Born in a rickety log house his grandfather built with hands that looked like barked-over wood themselves. He knew the forest like the back of his scarred palms, and he respected it in ways city people never could. The woods didn't care about your schedule or your comfort. It demanded patience, observation, and sometimes a little cunning. His cabin sat at the edge of the ridge, half hidden by cedars and pines, so secluded that even the occasional deer seemed startled when it stumbled across it. It wasn't much. A single-room wooden structure with a slanted roof, patched windows, and a door that didn't quite close without a shove. But it was home. To most, it would have been freezing, inhospitable even. Wood stoves crackled in every other cabin along the ridge, chimneys huffing smoke like exhausted lungs. Jackson's, however, remained eerily warm. And the secret was a trick no one in town seemed to believe, one that to them seemed almost weird. He woke that morning to frost glinting on the edges of his window pane, brushing sleep from his eyes as he heard the hollow whistle of wind skimming the ridgeline. He swung his legs over the bed, bare feet meeting the cold floor, and didn't flinch. That was the thing about Jackson Hale. He wasn't reckless, but he had a quiet stubbornness, an almost stubborn faith in the methods he'd spent years perfecting. "Morning, old girl," he muttered to the cabin, patting the wooden wall like it was a living creature. His voice was rough from sleep and the cold, but there was a warmth in it, an unspoken reverence. Jackson's mornings always started the same way. He checked the small trapline, inspected his gear, and listened to the forest wake. Yet, unlike other hunters, he never bothered with hauling firewood. He didn't need it, not in the winter, not in the way the townspeople assumed. Instead, he had built something of his own making, a system, simple and mechanical, but genius in its quiet logic. It was a kind of heat trap, an interplay of physics and intuition. During the day, sunlight slanted through a small window angled perfectly to hit a series of black-painted metal plates he'd installed across the floor and walls. The plates absorbed the heat and stored it, slowly releasing it when the sun dipped below the ridge. The cabin was insulated with layers of moss, old quilts, and tightly sealed shutters. Every vent, every tiny crack had been carefully considered. Jackson had experimented for years, testing, failing, and refining. The result was a cabin that, even when the mercury plunged to 0 or below, stayed at a steady, bearable warmth. But no one in Elkmont understood it. The sheriff's deputy had stopped by a month ago, shaking his head as if Jackson were playing a cruel joke. "You mean to tell me," he said, breath fogging in the cold air, "you've been through the last 2 weeks without a single fire, not even a spark?" Jackson shrugged, shoulders dusted with frost. "I told you it works." "You must be crazy," the deputy said, eyes narrowing. "Winter like this, you'll freeze before the sun rises." Jackson had smiled, not maliciously, but with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen the forest in ways others hadn't. "I've lived here long enough to know the forest doesn't give a damn about your doubt." That night he sat at the small table he'd carved himself, a mug of black coffee steaming in front of him, and listened to the wind thrash against the cabin. The trees groaned and the snow clattered off branches, but inside there was nothing but silence, warmth carried not by fire but by ingenuity. Jackson's mind wandered, tracing back to all the experiments that had led him here. Each winter was a test, each failure a lesson. He remembered the first winter he'd tried it, shivering in a half-built cabin, realizing that science and intuition could work in tandem. The concept was simple: heat in, insulation retained, slow release. The execution, however, had been a nightmare of trial and error. A knock on the door startled him. He frowned. Visitors were rare this far up the ridge. He opened it to find Millie Harper, a journalist from the local paper, bundled in layers of flannel and down, cheeks pink from the cold. "Jackson Hale?" she asked, breath visible in the frosty air. "That's me." He stepped aside, letting her in, and immediately she raised her eyebrows. "No fire?" she asked, incredulous as she glanced around. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood, comforting and alive. "None," he said, setting a pot of coffee in front of her. She sank into the chair opposite him, fingers brushing the warm mug. "Then how?" Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I guess you could call it a trick." Her skepticism was clear, but curiosity burned brighter. "A trick that keeps a cabin warm through an Appalachian winter without a single log. You know how that sounds." He leaned back, relaxed, letting the silence stretch. "I know, crazy, right?" Yet, as Millie watched him, she noticed something that surprised her. There was no hint of exaggeration in his tone. No boastful bravado. Just a calm certainty born of lived experience. And something else. A story buried beneath years of solitude and the kind of pride that came from knowing the woods better than any town council or heating engineer ever could. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the thin window panes. Jackson's gaze followed the streaks of white that danced across the ridgeline. "People see snow and think danger. I see opportunity. The sun gives more than light, it gives heat. You just have to be patient enough to catch it." Millie scribbled notes, her fingers frozen despite her gloves. She asked about the mechanics, about the materials, the angles, the design. But Jackson spoke in broad strokes, never giving away the entire method. Some secrets, he thought, deserved to stay in the forest. Later, as she prepared to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at him with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "I don't know if I believe it," she said softly. Jackson grinned, his teeth flashing white against the roughness of his face. "That's fair, most folks don't, but the cabin doesn't lie. You'll see it when the temperatures drop to 0 tomorrow." She left, leaving him alone once more. Jackson leaned against the door, listening to the storm outside, the forest alive and indifferent. He wasn't afraid of the cold. He had his methods, his solitude, and the knowledge that survival wasn't just about brute force. It was about respect, observation, and a little ingenuity. Night deepened, blanketing the ridge in darkness. The cabin, small and unassuming, hummed with a quiet warmth that seemed almost magical to anyone who didn't understand it. Jackson sat by the window, staring into the frozen forest, a man at peace with the world and the winter alike. But in the back of his mind, a new thought stirred, a challenge. One he hadn't faced in years, proving to the world that his weird trick wasn't just luck or folklore. That it worked, even when the skeptics came, even when the snow piled higher than ever. And deep down, he knew this winter would test him like never before. Because when the forest decides to remind you who's in charge, it does so without warning. The next morning dawned like a frozen whisper. The ridge was shrouded in thick fog, and the snow had turned from soft powder to a crunchy crust under the wind's relentless press. Jackson Hale woke before sunrise, the cabin still radiating a steady warmth that made stepping outside almost shocking. He pulled on his worn leather boots, tightened his wool scarf, and stepped out into the forest. Each breath came in clouds, fleeting and ephemeral, a reminder that the world outside his cabin was a harsh and unforgiving place. Down in Elkmont, the townspeople were already talking. Millie Harper's story had hit the paper with the subtlety of a snowball at high velocity. "Hunter keeps cabin warm without firewood," the headline screamed. Some scoffed, some were curious, and some, like Sheriff Daniels, simply shook their heads, muttering about city engineers laughing at Appalachian superstition. Jackson didn't care. He knew the forest had its own rules, and human disbelief didn't change them. He trudged through the snow toward the edge of the ridge, surveying the frozen valley below. His traps were set along this line of sight, a series of clever snares and sensors designed to alert him to movement. But today, his mind wasn't on the hunt. Today was about the experiment, about pushing the limits of what he had built. He knew that if this winter broke records, if the cold plunged harder than anyone remembered, the proof would come from the forest itself. Back at the cabin, Jackson's heat system had already begun its morning cycle. The black metal plates glistened faintly under the thin sun, holding warmth like captured sunlight bottled for midnight. He watched the temperature gauge he'd installed decades ago, a small dial attached to the wall, and nodded. Steady. Perfect. It wasn't just the plates, though. Jackson had taken years to understand airflow, the way heat traveled in a small space. He had designed vents and seals, traps and reflective panels that worked like a symphony, channeling energy where it was needed most. The forest had taught him about patience and observation, and in return he had built a home that the winter could not aim. By mid-morning, Millie returned, bundled even thicker than the day before. She had convinced the newspaper to let her come back, insisting she needed first-hand verification for her editors. She parked her car at the base of the ridge and trudged up the winding path, her notebook already in hand. Jackson was waiting at the cabin door, leaning on his rifle more for balance than defense. "Back for more skepticism?" he asked with a grin. "You could say that," she said, brushing snow from her shoulders. "I need to see it for myself. I don't care if the cold's killing everyone else. I'm here for your cabin." He stepped aside, letting her in. The warmth hit her like a wave, and she exhaled sharply. Okay, she admitted. "It's warm, how?" Jackson shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Like I said, it's a trick." She shook her head, but there was a spark of fascination in her eyes. "This is insane. You're insane." "Maybe," he said, sitting at the table, "but it works." The day stretched on. Millie asked questions, tried to measure and record to understand the delicate balance of sun, metal, and insulation. Jackson answered with patience, giving her glimpses without giving away the secrets. He wanted her to witness it, but he didn't need approval. The forest, the snow, the cold, they were his true witnesses. By afternoon, the wind picked up, howling across the ridge like a pack of unseen wolves. Snow lashed against the cabin walls, and the temperature outside plummeted further. Jackson's cabin, however, remained stubbornly warm. Millie touched the walls, her face pale with disbelief. This shouldn't be possible," she whispered. Jackson poured himself another cup of coffee. "Nothing in the forest is impossible," he said quietly. "It just takes understanding." Outside, a storm was brewing. The town below was beginning to feel the bite of a winter unlike any they had seen in decades. Roads were slick, power lines trembled under ice, and fireplaces burned tirelessly in every other cabin. Yet Jackson's little fortress stood untouched. Inside, the temperature never wavered, the coffee stayed hot, and the air smelled of pine and old wood rather than smoke. As evening fell, the storm intensified. The wind shrieked, rattling shutters and bending trees. Millie huddled under a thick blanket, scribbling notes furiously, her curiosity mingling with awe. Jackson, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with ease, adjusting a panel here, sealing a small crack there, all instinct and years of trial. Then the first real challenge came. A tree branch, heavy with ice, snapped and crashed against the side of the cabin, jolting Millie upright. Snow poured in through a small gap in the roof. Jackson cursed under his breath, grabbing a hammer and sealing the crack. "Storms are the real test," he muttered, "not people." Millie watched him, notebook forgotten. There was a rawness to his movements, a fierce practicality that came from surviving winters far harsher than this one. "You've done this before," she said softly. "Every year," he replied, "and every year teaches me something new." Hours passed. Outside, the storm raged unchecked. Inside, Jackson's cabin hummed with warmth, an island of calm in the frozen wilderness. Millie couldn't help but marvel at the contrast, the violent chaos of the forest outside versus the serene, controlled environment he had created. It was almost cinematic in its intensity, a stark reminder of human ingenuity meeting nature's might. Late that night, after the storm had reached its crescendo, Jackson and Millie sat by the window, staring out at the blizzard. The snow swirled like a living creature, and the wind roared like a beast in pain. Yet inside, they were safe. Warmth wrapped around them like a protective blanket, not a shred of firewood in sight. "You really are something else," Millie admitted. "I don't know how you do it, but I believe you now." Jackson's eyes twinkled. "Belief isn't necessary, results are." She laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound. "I guess the town will have to see it to believe it, too." Jackson leaned back, sipping his coffee, and allowed himself a rare smile. "Let them watch. Let them doubt. The forest doesn't care about their disbelief either. It only cares about those who respect it, who understand it." The storm raged on, a relentless, unfeeling force, but inside Jackson's cabin there was peace. A fragile, delicate peace that had been earned through years of observation, mistakes, and quiet determination. And as he looked at Millie, notebook clutched to her chest, He knew the story of his cabin would spread, not just for its warmth, but for the lesson it carried. Patience, ingenuity, and respect for the natural world were sometimes worth more than any fire could provide. But deep down, Jackson knew that the winter wasn't finished with him yet. The ridge was merciless, and storms like this had a way of testing even the most prepared. Tom. Oro or the day after or the next week, the cold would push harder. The forest would demand more. And Jackson Hale, hunter and hermit, inventor of a weird trick, would have to prove once again that his methods could withstand nature's wrath. The storm outside continued its symphony, a deafening reminder of the stakes. And as Jackson and Millie drifted toward a restless sleep, the cabin held its warmth against the relentless winter, a quiet rebellion against the odds. The night after the storm, silence fell over the ridge like a heavy, wet blanket. Jackson Hale awoke to the faint creak of snow settling on the roof and the occasional groan of frost-laden trees. The storm had passed, or so it seemed, but winter had left a gift in its wake, an even deeper, sharper cold that penetrated everything it touched. Jackson swung his legs over the edge of the bed, bare feet landing on the warm floor, and paused. Something felt different this morning. Not dangerous yet, but insistent. By the time Millie arrived at the cabin, bundled in layers that even she admitted were excessive, the cold outside had climbed to levels that had neighbors down in Elkmont scrambling for extra firewood. "Jackson, it's brutal out there," she said, teeth chattering despite her gloves. Her breath fogged the air as she stepped inside, and immediately the warmth of the cabin made her pause. How is it still warm?" she asked, almost whispering. Jackson didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, surveying the ridge. The snow was taller than the cabins in the town below, drift sculpted by wind into impossible shapes like frozen waves crashing over the landscape. The forest, usually calm and watchful, now seemed aggressive, alive with tension. "It's holding," he said finally. "For now." Millie frowned. "For now?" "The forest isn't done with us yet," he replied, his voice low, carrying the weight of someone who had faced winters like this before. "The real test comes after it pushes back." By midday, the test arrived. A sudden gust, fierce and unrelenting, rattled the cabin violently. Snow peeled off the trees like icy feathers, swirling into the air in blinding sheets. Jackson's instincts kicked in immediately. He moved with deliberate precision, checking the heat system, adjusting vents, ensuring that the panels absorbing sunlight were properly aligned despite the weakened light. The storm outside wasn't just cold, it was cunning, testing the boundaries of his design. Millie followed him nervously, notebook in hand, her reporter's curiosity tinged with fear. "Jackson, this is insane. I mean, it's beautiful, but this is dangerous." "Dangerous?" he echoed, eyes narrowing. "Maybe to the unprepared, but I've lived with the forest longer than anyone in town. I respect it, I watch it, I anticipate it." He paused, fixing a small metal plate at the edge of the window. "You can't fight winter with fire alone, you fight it with knowledge." The hours stretched. Outside, snow pounded the ridge like an army, relentless and chaotic. Trees bent under the weight, groaning like wounded animals, branches snapping and hitting the cabin with sharp cracks. Inside, the warmth held steady, a testament to Jackson's ingenuity. But then a new problem emerged. The small chimney vent, usually dormant, began to whistle sharply, a sign that ice had built up and obstructed airflow. Jackson grabbed a heavy glove and pulled the obstruction free, sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. "It's always something," he muttered, a hint of exhaustion in his voice. Millie watched him work, scribbling furiously, realizing that the weird trick was not just clever. It required vigilance, adaptation, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the environment. By evening, the storm had escalated to its fiercest. Visibility outside was almost zero, and the wind sounded like a living thing, moaning and wailing across the ridge. Jackson could feel the pressure in his chest, the kind that came not from fear but from anticipation. The forest was testing him, the cold was challenging him, and every failure could be fatal. Millie, sitting wrapped in blankets, finally spoke. "Jackson, what if it fails?" Her voice was barely audible over the howling wind. Jackson turned to her, calm but intense. "It won't, but it could get uncomfortable, that's all." He forced a smile, but inside a flicker of tension lingered. This was a storm unlike any he had faced. Even his confidence had limits. Then disaster struck. A massive gust ripped through the ridge, hitting the cabin's roof with the force of a battering ram. The small window that had captured the morning sun cracked, a thin line spreading across the glass. Snow seeped in, cold and relentless. Jackson reacted instantly, shielding Millie with his body and using his tools to barricade the breach. The cabin groaned under the pressure, the wooden walls vibrating, and for a moment the forest seemed victorious. Millie's face was pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Jackson, it's not going to hold, is it?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "It will." He worked faster, adjusting panels, tightening seals, monitoring the heat plates. Sweat ran down his face despite the freezing air. Every instinct, every lesson learned over decades was now being pushed to the limit. Hours passed like this, a relentless battle of human ingenuity against the raw, unyielding force of nature. The cabin held inch by inch, heat by heat. Jackson moved with precision, almost dancing around the small space, anticipating every gust, every threat. Millie watched in a mixture of awe and fear, realizing that survival in the forest was a blend of skill, respect, and stubbornness. By midnight, the storm finally began to subside. The wind's roar dulled to a low, mournful howl, and the snow settled into a thick, silent blanket. Jackson slumped against the wall, exhausted but triumphant. The cabin was intact, warm, and functioning exactly as he had intended. Millie, still wide-eyed, whispered, I can't believe it. You did it. You actually did it." Jackson smiled faintly, eyes weary but gleaming with quiet pride. "We did it," he corrected, acknowledging the storm as a worthy adversary. "But this was the real test. The winter doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't reward arrogance. It only respects preparation." Outside, the ridge was transformed. Trees bowed under the snow's weight, ice glistened like glass in the faint moonlight, and the forest was silent, almost reverent, as if acknowledging the endurance of the little cabin that refused to succumb. Jackson and Millie stepped outside briefly, the cold biting at their faces, but inside they both knew that the warmth they had preserved wasn't just physical. It was proof of human ingenuity and respect for nature's immutable rules. Millie, notebook forgotten now, turned to Jackson. "People are going to call it a miracle. I don't know if anyone will believe the science behind it." Jackson shrugged, a tired but satisfied expression on his face. "Let them call it what they want. The forest doesn't care about belief. It only cares about truth." As they re-entered the cabin, Jackson glanced around, noting the faint rise in temperature on the plates, the stable warmth spreading evenly through the space. Every inch of the cabin, every carefully placed panel and vent had played its part. The storm had been merciless, but it had also been instructive. And Jackson knew that while the world outside doubted, he had proven something far more important. Preparation, understanding, and respect could triumph even over nature's fiercest tests. That night, as snow settled in heavy drifts outside, Jackson sat by the window, coffee in hand, watching the aftermath. The forest was quiet, almost contemplative, as if acknowledging that the cabin had survived not by luck but by skill and persistence. Millie, asleep under a blanket, dreamt of headlines and stories, but Jackson's thoughts wandered to the ridge itself, the ridge that had taught him patience, humility, and ingenuity. Winter, relentless and brutal, had tested him, and he had prevailed. Morning arrived like a muted promise. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the ridge glistening under a pale, frosty sun. Snow lay thick and undisturbed, untouched except for the occasional imprint of a deer or fox. The world was silent, save for the distant dripping of melting ice from branches. Jackson Hale stepped outside, inhaling the crisp, clean air. For the first time in days, there was no wind, no roar of frozen chaos, just stillness. Inside, the cabin remained a sanctuary of warmth. The black metal plates had retained their heat perfectly through the night, releasing it slowly, evenly, like a heartbeat in the cold. Millie stirred awake, rubbing her eyes, and immediately froze as the reality of the cabin's conditions hit her. "Jackson, it's still warm," she whispered, all lacing her voice. Jackson chuckled softly. "Told you, that's why patience is everything." He poured them both coffee, the steam curling into the frosty air like a tiny victory flag. "Every winter teaches a lesson," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Some winters teach it with whispers, some with storms. That one, well, it shouted." Millie looked around, notebook forgotten on the table. Her mind wasn't on facts and figures right now. It was on the story she'd just witnessed, a tale of human ingenuity pitted against the raw, unforgiving power of nature. "People are going to think we're crazy," she admitted. "They're going to call this a miracle or a gimmick." Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Let them think what they want. The forest doesn't care. The cabin doesn't care. Truth doesn't need witnesses, just persistence." By midday, the first visitors began arriving in town. Curious neighbors, townsfolk eager to see if the headlines were true, trudged through the snow to catch a glimpse of Jackson's little cabin. Word had spread quickly. The hunter who kept a cabin warm all winter without firewood. Skeptical eyes scanned the ridge, whispering doubts and incredulity. Jackson stood at the edge of the ridge as Millie approached him with a camera. "You ready for the show?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Jackson nodded, though he didn't seek recognition. "The cabin will do the talking," he said. "Just don't break it." The first visitors reached the cabin, shaking snow off their coats and stepping cautiously inside. Warmth hit them immediately, making them step back in surprise. Gasps and murmurs filled the small space. Some tried to peer under the floorboards, tap the walls, look for hidden stoves or secret fires, but found nothing. Jackson, leaning casually against the wall, watched quietly, letting the results speak. One neighbor, an older man named Hank, finally shook his head. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "No firewood, no stove, just warm." He laughed, a deep, genuine chuckle shaking snow from his hat. "Boy, I thought I'd seen everything this ridge could throw at me." Millie captured every reaction, her notes turning into a narrative more than a technical report. "It's more than science," she murmured to Jackson during a quiet moment. "It's art almost, a conversation between man and nature." Jackson gave her a small nod. "You learn to listen when you spend enough time out here. The forest talks, you just have to pay attention. Heat, cold, wind, snow, they all speak in their own language. The trick is learning to respond, not fight." As the day progressed, more visitors arrived, and even skeptics couldn't deny the results. Children giggled as they touched the walls, warm and inviting despite the deep snow outside. Elders nodded in quiet respect, murmuring about wisdom learned from years of life in the mountains. Jackson didn't explain everything. He let the curiosity linger. Some secrets, after all, deserved the respect of mystery. That evening, as the ridge glowed under the fading light of the sun, Jackson and Millie stepped outside, snow crunching underfoot. The storm's aftermath had transformed the forest into a cathedral of ice and frost. Light refracted through icicles, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the drifts. Jackson breathed deeply, feeling the quiet triumph of a winter survived, a challenge met and overcome. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Millie asked softly. "All the preparation, the experiments, the cold." Jackson shook his head. "Never. Every winter is different. Every winter teaches something new. The forest doesn't repeat itself, and neither do I." He paused, eyes scanning the ridge as if reading the land itself. "Some people hunt for trophies, some hunt for stories. I hunt for understanding." Millie smiled, realizing that she had just lived through a story that would be told for years. Not just of warmth or ingenuity, but of patience, courage, and respect. Of a man who refused to be conquered by the winter and found harmony with a forest that spared no mercy. Night fell deep and still. The cabin glowed softly against the darkened ridge, a beacon of warmth and ingenuity. Inside, Jackson sipped his coffee, watching the forest breathe under the weight of snow. Outside, Millie wrote feverishly, capturing not just facts, but the feeling of the day, the awe, the fear, the triumph. And somewhere deep in the ridge, the forest settled, acknowledging a hunter who had not merely survived, but understood. A hunter whose weird trick had defied expectations, challenged skepticism, and reminded everyone that sometimes the simplest, most overlooked solutions were the most profound. Jackson Hale leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment. The storm had ended, the ridge was silent, and the cabin was warm. The forest had tested him, and he had passed. And in that warmth, that quiet mastery, he found not just survival, but peace. The ridge would endure, the cabin would endure. And Jackson Hale, the hunter who listened to the wind and the sun, would endure too.